Hello, Hornets, and welcome to the 2021 Martin Luther King Jr. Day presentation. Before we get started, we'd like to thank you for joining us and hope you enjoy this presentation. Now, if you could, please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Today, we'll not only talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest accomplishments, but we'll also take a deeper approach into his life and examine how he became the man we know today. Come along with us as we look at the risks he took for blacks and other minorities in America, and how he created his own history. Let us start from the beginning and take a glimpse into his life and how his actions still impact us today.
On January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, Michael King, later known as Martin Luther King Jr., was born into the loving arms of his parents, Alberta Williams King and Martin Luther King Sr. Raised in middle class, his encounters with racial discrimination were far less than others. His first experience with racism was when his white classmates attended a color-specific school that he could not attend because he was black. His mother had to sit him down and explain the many years in history of slavery and discrimination against the people of his same skin color. This was the first of many injustices MLK would face throughout his lifetime.
Moving into the later years of his childhood, King's parents always encouraged him to work hard, stand up for himself, and fight for what he believed in. Keeping up with academics, being the quarterback of his high school football team, and graduating high school at the age of 15 kept King busy. His hard work in high school paid off when he attended Morehouse College that following September of 1944.
His beginning years at Morehouse College were not ideal, as he struggled with his relationship with the Baptist Church. He'd taken interest in sociology and was torn between medicine and law. Morehouse helped MLK take his first steps into human rights as he read an essay that focused on justice over law. This inspired MLK to pursue and focus on civil rights in his studies, which was most likely one of the many reasons MLK was such a strong advocate for injustice of all sizes.
This led MLK to write a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution that was published in 1964, which stated that black people are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens. He received his BA in sociology from Morehouse College at 19 in 1948. He received his Crozier Theological Seminary degree and enrolled in Boston University PhD program in 1951. He married New England Conservatory music student Coretta Scott in 1953. He became a minister of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in 1954, located in Montgomery, Alabama. He received his PhD in systematic theology from Boston University in 1955. And on November 17, 1955, he welcomed his firstborn, Yolanda Denise King.
In 1955, 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. led a boycott of segregated Montgomery buses that quickly gained national attention. This boycott was in protest to the segregating seating, which was also heavily advocated by the widely known Rosa Parks. To help explain the true meaning of the Montgomery bus boycott, please watch this short video explaining in depth what happened.
In Montgomery, Alabama, people looked at how they were being impacted negatively by their society, and they assumed responsibility for change.
Joanne Robinson was an English professor at Alabama State University, and she headed up an organization called the Women's Political Council. Joanne Robinson had an episode on the Montgomery bus where she is accosted by a bus driver, and she leaves the bus, in terror. She thought the bus driver was going to hit her as he demanded she sit in the black-only section in an almost empty bus. When she talked to other women in the Women's Political Council about this episode, she found out that they had similar experiences. There were a number of arrests in 1955 of black women who were violating the segregation ordinance on the buses. And on the night of December 1st, when Rosa Parks is arrested, Joanne Robinson springs into action, and they actually execute this plan to initiate a bus boycott.
At the time, most people rode the bus. to kind of get around. There weren't as many cars on the road. So you begin to realize that if we don't ride the buses, we are able to kind of break the system to a great degree.
Joanne Robinson comes on campus late that night with a couple of students, runs off 50,000 flyers. The next morning, between classes, they pass out these flyers. She calls a civil rights attorney, Fred Gray. She calls E.D. Nixon, labor organizer, really the recognized leader of Black Montgomery. And they decide to endorse the boycott. They organize the Montgomery Improvement Association to execute and to coordinate the activities surrounding the Montgomery bus boycott. And they select this newcomer, Martin Luther King, to head up the Montgomery Improvement Association. Martin Luther King breathes into Montgomery ideas about love and civil disobedience, overcoming adversity.
And the people of Montgomery were willing not only to listen, but to act on this.
I was the NAACP Youth Council president, and I participated in the boycott. I walked to school, and we just saw the empty buses go by because there were no black people on them.
At the time that this movement began here, we had about 50,000 African Americans living in Montgomery, and there were pretty close to 50,000 black people who worked together during this bus boycott.
We stayed off the buses and found other ways to get to where we needed to go.
And so they bought station wagons. And they had an actual route, just like buses have routes.
For several weeks, I was a volunteer driver, every day going out and just hauling people to work or to school.
So people just didn't walk. They rode, but they rode on a system that they created. 382 days. That's a long time. Can you imagine how empowered people felt? It's like, we did what?
The Montgomery bus boycott says to the nation that segregation is no longer the law of the land, and that the formula for attacking segregation in all of its facets is going to be nonviolent civil disobedience on one hand and litigation on the other.
The boycott was one of the greatest examples of civic engagement of the 20th century.
Martin Luther King Jr. faced many challenges for voicing his opinions. In 1956, he received threatening phone calls, and then not many days later, his house was bombed. His wife and child were safe, but this would not be the last and only time Martin Luther King Jr. would have to deal with violence. To quote him, "The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish truth." King always preached of peace, love, and kindness, which were the foundation of his effort to create change.
On November 13th of 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court affirms the lower court opinion in Browder v. Gale, declaring Montgomery and Alabama bus segregation laws unconstitutional. A couple weeks later, on December 21st, Montgomery City Lines resumed full service on all routes, and King was among the first passengers to ride the buses in an integrated fashion.
With MLK pushing more boundaries of civil liberty and justice, he found himself in trouble with the law. In 1963, on April 12th, he wrote the Letter from Birmingham Jail, a powerful and well-known letter from his jail cell that brought to light the extreme effort and spirit necessary for the freedom of all people. In this video, they will read a quick excerpt from the article. Please take time to carefully listen in hopes of leaving you with something to think about.
What we're going to read together in this video is what has become known as Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote from a jail cell in 1963 after he and several of his associates were arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, as they non-violently protested segregation there. And I'm going to read an excerpt of it. I encourage you to read it in its entirety. It is one of the most powerful documents, frankly, I have ever read. And Martin Luther King often gets a lot of credit as an amazing speaker. People say, hey, he could read the phone book and it would move people. But this also speaks to what an incredible writer he was. Not only is it moving, but it really gives the philosophical underpinnings of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And many people attribute the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by Congress, as being heavily influenced by Martin Luther King's letter. Now, what motivated Martin Luther King to write this letter was a statement made in a newspaper by 8 Alabama clergymen, which encouraged the protesters to wait, saying that yes, we are sympathetic to the injustices, but they should be resolved in the courts and not through the type of protest, the type of tension that Martin Luther King and his fellow protesters were creating. And so here's just an excerpt of what Martin Luther King wrote. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, when you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. I've read this many times, but every time I read it, and this is just an excerpt, as you can tell, it's incredibly powerful, and I encourage you to read it in its entirety and think about why this was such a powerful document, especially for catalyzing things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
MLK continued to push boundaries, and on August 28th of 1964, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin organized a March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This attracted more than 200,000 demonstrators to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. MLK gave his established I Have a Dream speech to this monstrous and justice-hungry crowd that only inspired the audience more.
The following year of 1964, King had many accomplishments. For example, he won Man of the Year by Time magazine on January 3rd, and finished the year by winning a Nobel Peace Prize in early December. But just as any human, MLK also had setbacks. He demanded to be served at a whites-only restaurant, which ended in MLK being arrested. This proved to King and the black community that their fight for equal rights was far from over.
Although King preached of love, joy, and kindness, violence followed his was the year 1965, when his peaceful protest led to high representation of police brutality. In an event that became known as Bloody Sunday, voting rights marchers were beaten at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. But even with all the tear gas and horrible beating of protesters, the year 1965 also promised good news. That year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which suspended literacy tests and other restrictions to prevent black people from color from voting.
As we reflect on a different time in history, let us be reminded that every person has the opportunity to create change on a historic level. MLK may have started out as a discriminated middle-class black man with a passion for equality, but he is now known to be one of the most pivotal advocates in civil rights history.
Here are a few images from civil rights marches that impacted citizens all across the nation. The popular phrase, "A picture says 1,000 words," does not do these images justice and can prove that actions often speak louder than words do.
MLK accomplished so much and had goals to achieve so much more. But sadly, MLK's life was taken from him on April 14th of 1968. He was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was just 39 years old and he left behind a legacy. Martin Luther King Jr. had an impact on American civil rights, and we are celebrating his work, his influence, and his voice. He was a man who never backed down from his beliefs and fought for peace and unity. We celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day not just to remember his work, but to honor his dream, that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We'd hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Thank you for joining us today, Hornets, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.